It was the summer of 2008 when Jessica, a 24-year-old teacher, moved into a small, old house in the quiet town of Lewiston, Maine. She had found the place through an online ad. The rent was cheap, and it was located near the school where she had just been hired. Jessica wasn't one to believe in the supernatural, so when she noticed the eerie vibe of the place, she shrugged it off. The house, after all, was a bit worn down with creaky wooden floors and peeling wallpaper. But within days of moving in, odd things began to happen. At first, it was just small, unsettling occurrences, doors that would be open when she swore she had closed them, lights flickering in the middle of the night, and the unmistakable sound of footsteps above her, though she knew the attic was locked and empty. One night, while preparing to go to bed, she heard a distinct whisper, a raspy voice that said her name. Jessica. Frozen, her heart pounded in her chest, she turned around, expecting someone to be there, but there was nothing. It was as if the house itself had spoken. She checked her phone to ensure she wasn't just hearing things, but her notifications were silent. The only sound was the constant hum of dread, growing louder in her ears. She tried to ignore it, chalking it up to stress from her new job, but the disturbances became more frequent. Objects would disappear and reappear in different places: her keys, her wallet, a book she was reading. Shadows danced in her peripheral vision, and strange cold drafts would brush against her, like icy fingers. One night, after weeks of living in unease, Jessica finally called her friend Sarah and invited her over. She needed someone to confirm she wasn't going crazy. Sarah arrived with a bottle of wine, and the two of them sat in the living room, laughing about their high school days. For the first time in a while, Jessica felt normal. But then the laughter stopped. A sudden, loud crash echoed from the attic above them. Both women froze. Jessica's heart sank as she met Sarah's eyes. She wasn't alone in hearing it this time. "What was that?" Sarah whispered, her face pale. "I don't know. Something's wrong with this house." Jessica hesitated but finally stood up. "I need to check it out." Together, they grabbed a flashlight and climbed the creaky stairs to the attic. When they reached the door, it was slightly ajar, something Jessica knew was impossible because she had never unlocked it. Her hand trembled as she pushed the door open. The attic was dimly lit by the beam of the flashlight, but what they saw made them both gasp. Scrawled all over the walls, in a deep, rusty red, were the words, "I see you." Jessica's body trembled. She knew this hadn't been here before. The air was thick with the smell of iron, and she felt something heavy pressing against her chest. The words seemed fresh, like someone, or something, had just written them. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. Sarah screamed. "Get out!" Jessica grabbed her friend's arm, pulling her toward the stairs. But as they reached the landing, the door to the attic slammed shut with a deafening bang, locking them inside. They banged on the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in. "Jessica, something's in here with us," Sarah whimpered. A deep, guttural voice filled the room, echoing in the darkness. "I've been waiting." Jessica's breath hitched as icy fingers wrapped around her ankle, pulling her to the floor. She screamed, thrashing violently as an unseen force dragged her toward the corner of the attic, where the air grew colder, almost freezing. Sarah grabbed her arm, trying to hold on, but it was no use. Jessica's screams echoed as she was pulled into the dark. Everything went silent. The police found Sarah the next morning, unconscious at the base of the attic door. She was hysterical, unable to speak about what happened. Jessica, however, was gone. Her belongings were still in the house, but there was no sign of her. She had simply vanished. The case went cold, and Jessica was never found. But the house remained. New tenants came and went, but they all reported the same things: cold drafts, whispers, objects moving on their own, and the ominous feeling of being watched. The house seemed to reject anyone who entered, as if it were waiting for something, or someone. Years later, a family moved into the house, unaware of its history. One night, their young daughter came downstairs, her face pale. "Mommy," she whispered, "there's a woman in my room." The mother brushed it off as a nightmare until the daughter added, "She's crying. She says her name is Jessica, and she's trapped." As the mother comforted her daughter, she noticed something chilling on the floor next to the bed, scratches in the wood, as if someone had clawed at it, trying to get out. The family left the next day, but the house remains, waiting for its next visitors, the whispers growing louder each year, and no one ever found out what truly happened to Jessica, but the house never forgot her. In 2012, A young couple named Mark and Emily bought an old Victorian house in the rural town of Shadewood, England. They were drawn to its charm, despite its slightly neglected appearance. The house had been on the market for years, largely ignored because of local legends surrounding it. The villagers whispered about strange disappearances, unsettling apparitions, and the overwhelming sense of dread that filled anyone who stayed too long. But Mark and Emily didn't believe in ghost stories. They dismissed the warnings as nothing more than local folklore designed to scare newcomers. They were eager to begin their life together in their dream home, ignoring the cautious looks from their new neighbors. The first few weeks passed without incident. The couple spent their time fixing up the house, painting walls, patching holes, and unpacking. But soon, the peaceful days gave way to strange occurrences. It started small, with doors creaking open on their own and objects disappearing only to be found in odd places later. Emily laughed it off. "It's just an old house," she'd say, brushing it aside. Mark agreed, but there was something about the way the house seemed to breathe at night, the way the floorboards creaked in the dead of night when no one was walking, the constant cold that filled certain rooms, no matter how much they heated the place. Then came the whispers. At first, they were faint, just a soft murmur barely audible over the wind. Emily thought it was her imagination, or perhaps the wind seeping through the cracks in the old walls. But as the days passed, the whispers grew louder, more distinct, and impossible to ignore. They came at night, while the couple lay in bed, drifting between sleep and wakefulness. "Leave. It's not safe." Emily often woke up in a cold sweat, her heart racing as she looked around the dark room. She would nudge Mark, asking if he heard anything, but he would groggily shake his head and roll back over. It wasn't until one night, when the voice came louder than ever, that Mark finally heard it too. "They're coming." Mark sat up abruptly, his skin prickling with fear. He looked around the room, but there was no one there. The house was quiet, the air still, but the feeling that something, or someone, was there lingered, oppressive and suffocating. The next day, they found scratches on the walls, long, deep gouges that hadn't been there the night before. They were arranged in patterns, almost like symbols, and despite their best efforts to scrub them away, they returned every morning, freshly etched. Mark and Emily grew more and more paranoid. Sleep became difficult, their dreams haunted by shadowy figures and indistinct voices. Emily began waking up with bruises, as though someone, or something, had been gripping her in the night. One evening, desperate for answers, they decided to search the attic, a place they had avoided since moving in. It was a cramped, dusty space, filled with old, forgotten furniture and crates left by previous owners. As they rummaged through the attic, they found a small wooden box tucked away in the corner, wrapped in a tattered cloth. Inside the box was an old, worn-out journal. The entries were written in shaky, rushed handwriting. The further they read, the more their blood ran cold. It belonged to a man who had lived in the house decades ago, and his words spoke of the same whispers, the same shadows, the same fear that now plagued them. The last entry was short, scrawled with desperation. "They come for the ones who don't remember, they feed on the forgotten. We are next." Suddenly, the lights in the attic flickered and went out. The temperature dropped dramatically, and they felt an overwhelming sense of dread. In the darkness, Emily screamed as icy fingers grazed her neck. Mark turned, but there was nothing to be seen, only shadows dancing in the faint light filtering through the cracks. They rushed down the stairs, but the whispers followed, louder and more persistent. "Leave, leave." They didn't hesitate. That night, they packed a few essentials and fled the house, driving to the nearest hotel, too terrified to return. But even as they sat in the safety of their hotel room, the feeling of dread remained. Emily looked in the mirror and gasped. There were fresh bruises forming around her neck, shaped like handprints. The next morning, they returned to the house to collect the rest of their belongings. But something was terribly wrong. The house looked different, dilapidated, older than it had just the day before. The windows were broken, the roof caved in, and the once beautiful garden was overgrown with weeds. It was as if no one had lived there in decades. Confused and terrified, they called the local authorities. When the police arrived, they stared at Mark and Emily in disbelief. "This house has been abandoned for over 50 years, the officer said, shaking his head. "No one's lived here since the last family disappeared without a trace." Mark and Emily were speechless, their minds reeling. They showed the officer the journal, but he dismissed it, claiming it had been found years ago during a search of the house. The authorities had long written off the place as cursed, and no one dared to buy it. But Mark and Emily knew what they had experienced was real. They had been there, living in that house just yesterday. Or had they? As they stood outside the crumbling ruins of the house, Emily's phone buzzed. She looked down at the screen and paled. The date read March 20th, 2062. 50 years had passed since the night they fled. The whispers had never left them. They had simply forgotten. And now, the shadows waited. They were next. It was 1998 when Drive. Andrew Collins, a renowned psychiatrist, took on a case that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The patient, Samantha Dawson, had been committed to Ravenwood Asylum after the mysterious death of her entire family. The official report labeled it as an accident. A fire had claimed the lives of her parents and younger sister, but the whispers around town told a darker tale. Samantha, found unharmed, sitting in the ruins of the house, was said to have whispered one thing when the police arrived. It wasn't the fire, it was them. No one could understand what she meant, and after months of erratic behavior and terrifying outbursts, she was institutionalized. Dr. Collins had dealt with trauma cases before, but nothing like this. He was intrigued, drawn to the mystery of what truly happened that night. When he first met Samantha, she sat curled up in the corner of her padded cell, her long, dark hair falling over her face. Her eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, seemed to stare through him, as though seeing something far beyond the room. For weeks, she refused to speak to him. He would sit there, patiently waiting, asking gentle questions, but she would only rock back and forth, muttering to herself in a low, unintelligible voice. But one day, something changed. As he sat down across from her, Samantha finally spoke. "They're coming for you, you know." Her voice was flat, emotionless, but her words sent a chill down Dr. Collins' spine. "Who's coming, Samantha?" he asked softly, leaning forward. "They don't forget," she whispered, her eyes locking onto his. "Once you see them, they never let you go." Dr. Collins tried to press for more, but Samantha's face twisted in fear. She clamped her hands over her ears and began screaming, a blood-curdling sound that echoed through the halls of the asylum. The orderlies rushed in to sedate her, but the damage was done. Those hollow eyes haunted him for days. That night, as Dr. Collins sat in his office, reviewing his notes, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. The air felt heavier, colder, as if an invisible presence lingered just out of sight. He dismissed it as exhaustion, but when he looked up, his heart nearly stopped. In the reflection of his window, he saw movement, just a flicker, a shadow that shouldn't have been there. Slowly, he turned around, but the office was empty. His pulse quickened, and for the first time in his career, he felt genuinely unsettled. The words Samantha had spoken echoed in his mind. "Once you see them, they never let you go." Over the next few days, the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long in his home, and at night, he would hear soft, distant whispers, barely audible but undeniably there. Each time he looked around, nothing was out of place, but the oppressive presence was constant, gnawing at his nerves. He returned to Ravenwood, determined to get answers from Samantha. He found her in the same corner of her padded cell, but this time, she wasn't rocking back and forth. She was smiling. "They found you," she said, her voice unnervingly calm. Dr. Collins swallowed hard, feeling an icy fear wrap around his throat. "Who has found me, Samantha?" Her smile widened, her teeth showing in a grotesque grin. "The ones with the hollow eyes. They come for the ones who try to understand. You've seen them now, haven't you?" Before he could respond, the lights in the room flickered and went out, plunging them into complete darkness. In the pitch black, Dr. Collins heard something move, a faint shuffling, like something brushing against the walls. Then came the breathing, heavy, ragged breaths that were too close, far too close. Panic surged through him. "Samantha, what's happening?" "They're here," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the oppressive silence. "They like the dark." The room grew colder, and for a moment, Dr. Collins felt a pressure on his chest, as if something invisible was pushing down on him. He fumbled for his flashlight and turned it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. But when the light landed on Samantha, she was gone. Her cell was empty. Dr. Collins frantically looked around, but there was no trace of her. The whispers in the room grew louder, incoherent but relentless, and then, just outside the range of his flashlight, he saw them, figures, barely visible in the shadows. Their eyes were hollow, empty voids, staring straight at him. Frozen with fear, Dr. Collins tried to back away, but the door behind him was sealed shut. The shadows moved closer, their hollow eyes fixed on him, drawing the warmth from the room until his breath fogged in the air. One of the figures reached out, its skeletal fingers just inches from his face. And then everything went black. Dr. Collins woke up the next morning in his office, slumped over his desk. He was drenched in sweat, his heart racing, but he was alive. He immediately drove back to Ravenwood, determined to find out what had happened to Samantha. But when he arrived, the staff greeted him with confusion. "There's no patient named Samantha Dawson here," the head nurse told him. "Never has been." Dr. Collins insisted, but no records existed of her ever being admitted. Her file was gone, her cell was occupied by a different patient, and every trace of her presence had been erased. It was as if she had never existed. But the whispers followed him. No matter where he went, he could hear them in the corners of his mind. And at night, the shadows grew longer, the cold more biting. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those hollow, empty voids staring back at him. Dr. Collins retired from psychiatry a few months later, his mind unraveling. He became a recluse, barricading himself in his home, windows covered, lights always on. But it didn't matter. They never let him go. One evening, his neighbors heard him screaming, loud, desperate cries for help. By the time they broke down his door, the house was silent. They found his body curled up in the corner of his study, his face frozen in a twisted expression of horror. The room was empty, but scrawled across the walls in black, jagged letters were the words, "We never forget." And neither did the hollow eyes.